الله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين واللعنة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين أما بعد. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for joining us in our second week of Dua-e-Tawassul. And again, inshallah, our goal is to talk about the history of the Ahlul Bayt and to build a deeper connection with these 14 Masoomeen with whom we are asking Allah to connect us and by their rights fulfill our desires and our needs. One of the important parts of this Dua-e-Tawassul that we recite every week is taking the time that as we're asking for their shafa'ah and their intercession, that we also ask Allah for our needs and our desires by their intercession as well too. So wherever we are in this world, we have the ability to ask by the wasila of these personalities because they are the hujjah, the authority of Allah over the entirety of the earth. So sometimes it happens, we think about that, oh, when I go to ziyarat, then my du'as are accepted. The reason for that more fits to the fact, the sincerity and the depth of du'a that I make. The Imam's authority is not restricted to Najaf or Karbala or Kadhmain or Samarra or Mashhad or Medina. Rather, the Imam's authority is over this earth. But it's on me to be able to invoke that authority correctly, and which is why part of this dua that we recite is asking Allah by the sincere authority that they possess. Looking at that, focusing on the topic of our discussion, we've been talking about and starting the story of the Ahlul Bayt by talking about the ancestry of the Holy Prophet and explaining how all of the ancestry of the Holy Prophet were people who were what we call mawahid. Mawahid is someone who believes in the oneness and tawheed of Allah. If you take a look and you see that the entire lineage of our Holy Prophet, from Adam until him, there is no one in that lineage who was a na'uzubillah pagan, a disbeliever, an atheist, or anything of that nature. They were all people who believed in the oneness of Allah. The proof of this, when we talk about in the history, we see from, for example, Nabi Ismail all the way to Abdul Mutalib, each one of these individuals possessed the characteristic of believing in one God. Us, we believe in this statement whenever we say, for example, Ashhadu annaka kunta nuran fil aslab al-shamikha wal arham al-mutahhara lam tunajjiska al-jahiliyatu bi anjasihim. When we recite the ziyarat of our Holy Prophet and all of the Imams, we make the same statement that I bear witness as part of my faith that you were never in the impure loins or wombs of those who are ignorant, and ignorance has never cast its filth upon you. This statement tells us that everyone that Allah chose to represent the Prophet's family and to represent the Prophet's lineage was someone who believed in the oneness of God. Intellectually, we believe in this statement as well too, when we look at the principle that how could it be that one of the forefathers of our Holy Prophet would not be eligible to receive the intercession or the support of the Prophet? And if they were pagans or polytheists, that would immediately cast them out of that process of being attached to and being tied to the purity of the Holy Prophet. One of the interesting things that we started mentioning last week was in the life of Hazrat Abdul Mutalib, the grandfather of our Holy Prophet, whose name we also mentioned was Shaybat al-Hamd. There's an event associated with the life of Shaybat al-Hamd, Abdul Mutalib, that is actually recounted in the Holy Quran and is one of the important fundamentals about knowing about our Prophet and his birth. You see, in old Arabia, I was going to say ancient Arabia, but old Arabia, years were not numbered. They were known by significant events that took place in the year. And our Prophet's year of birth is known as Amul Fil, or the year of the elephant. This event in the history of Arabia and in the history of the birth of our Prophet bears a great significance, so much so that Allah addresses it in the Holy Quran and wants to make sure that people don't forget this incident. So for that basis, we'll recount this incident today as part of our discussion around the biography and the history of the Holy Prophet. You see, in the time of the birth of the Prophet, the Kaaba was the central gathering place or the hub of all of Arabia. And it was a central trading location that all of society would gather at. And people from all different cultures, backgrounds would come to the Kaaba, and their trade would take place, communities would develop, people would meet, and it became the place of connection in society. And this was part of the reason of the honor of the Quraysh. that they were the hosts of all of Arabia. And we mentioned Abdul Mutalib was the keeper of the Kaaba and the holder of Zamzam, such that he was the one who provided water to all those who came to visit. And he held the keys of the Kaaba that everyone would come to visit. Yemen was a very Christian area at this point in time, and Sana'a was a Christian city that was under the Habashi Empire at this point in time. The Habashi Empire referred to Ethiopia. Ethiopia's old name is also Habash. And this was a large Christian kingdom that was connected to the Roman kingdom to the north and was something that held a stronghold of Christianity in the south. We know about the stronghold of Christianity because when the Muslims began being established in the city of Mecca and they were being persecuted, the Prophet sent the Muslims to seek sanctuary with the Christians of Habash, of Ethiopia, away from the persecution of Mecca. But before the advent of Islam, in the year of the birth of our Prophet, the Christians of Ethiopia, the Christians of Habash, had started to see that all of the Arabs gather in Mecca and wanted to build an alternative location where the people would gather and make a new central hub in the city of Sana'a. What they did was they took funds from Rome and they took funds from their kingdom and they started the establishment of a giant church in the city of Sana'a with the intention that people would then come to this location for ibadat and worship, and this would become the new central hub of all of Arabia and would overshadow the history of Mecca. And they started building this giant church. As they were building this giant church, famously what happens is one of the Arabs of Mecca who saw this as an affront, who saw this as someone trying to take away their superiority, went to this new church and in the process of its construction, defiled and desecrated this church. And it was with the intention of, for example, showing their superiority, oh, that this place doesn't compare with Mecca. The same way today, we see people who, for example, feel the superiority of their city and they want to show their superiority. They may disrespect another location. This man went and did something very bad, and he desecrated this church. Abraha, who happened to be a general of the army of Habash, as well as the governor of this area or the leader of this area, seeing the desecration of his church, became very upset and very affronted and decided to raise an army and in reply for this desecration, go and destroy the Kaaba because of what people had done to the church in Sana'a. Now, what's interesting is the army that he raised, because he was connected to Ethiopia, Ethiopia being a part of Africa, one of the major attributes that he possessed in the army that he called were elephants as well too, and was a very massive army from the entire Christian empire. But the interesting thing was that he couldn't figure out a way how to get his army from Yemen to Mecca, because Mecca exists beyond a great desert. And what happens is, in the process of him raising an army, he finds an Arab Bedouin who's connected to the city of Mecca, and he makes the Arab Bedouin take him and guide him from Yemen all the way to the Kaaba. Because of the desert in the middle, without having someone to guide them, the army would have failed, because how do you move an army through a desert? But the Bedouins who lived in the desert knew where there are stops for water and where there are safe places to get water and resources and move comfortably and easily through the desert. So sure enough, Abraha's success in reaching the city of Mecca relied on him finding one of these Bedouins who would guide his army. And he did. And it was one of the first incursions of a foreign army into this location. And Abraha slowly moved this giant army, and including elephants who are not native or natural to a desert, and whose movement through a desert would have been very difficult without proper guidance. But he moved all of them from Yemen, from Sana'a, all the way to the outskirts of Mecca. When he gets to the outskirts of Mecca, the tribes of Mecca become very frightened and afraid, and they've never seen elephants before. It hasn't happened that an army has brought such a large army and incursion into these lands. And the Arabs, hearing that, oh, someone was coming to attack them, that few tribes nearby had gathered together and said that, oh, we'll launch a defense. We'll defend our lands. We'll defend the Kaaba. We'll do what we can. But upon seeing the massive army of Abraha, the many elephants that they possessed and the many soldiers and the proper weapons, the Arabs had never faced a force like this, because no force had ever been able to cross the desert into Mecca, into this land that was surrounded by desolation and nothing in desert. So they were really overcome, and it was a real sight to see. In this, Abraha, as he comes close, he sends out his soldiers and emissaries to the area to go and capture whatever resources they could. And they captured many of the animals from the herding and from the tribes of the Quraysh and the tribes of Mecca. They captured their animals that were outside of the city and were grazing on the little bit of land that was available, including famously about 200 camels of Abdul Muttalib were captured, who they knew was the leader of the city of Mecca. Abraha, having captured all of these animals and everything, prepared his army to attack upon the city of Mecca and sent emissaries into the city of Mecca to tell the people that Abraha has no interest in bothering the people. He just wants to destroy the Kaaba as a reply to the desecration that the church faced in Sena, and that if the people let him complete his task, he would leave them without causing them any harm or any trouble. When this news reached Abdul Muttalib, he told the people to go out to the mountains and the hills around Mecca. Because remember, Mecca is a valley, and at the base of a valley around it are mountains. So he sent everybody, he said, go out to the mountains, go out to these other areas, I'll deal with this. And Abdul Muttalib, along with a few of his companions, stayed in the city, and they went out to go meet with Abraha. Famously, there's a discussion that's recorded between Abraha and Abdul Muttalib that Abraha had been appraised that the leader of the Quraysh, the leader of the city of Mecca, the keeper of the keys of the Kaaba, the keeper of the water of the Kaaba, was all in the hands of Abdul Muttalib, and he was the leader of this area, and that he had come to now meet with Abraha. So Abraha was quite curious to see, what does this man look like? And when Abdul Muttalib enters, Abraha is immediately overcome by the awe and the presence of Abdul Muttalib. And he's just awestruck by this personality standing in front of him. And out of respect, Abraha gets off of his throne. He sits Abdul Muttalib next to him. He sits on the ground next to him. And he says to Abdul Muttalib, Faddal, ask me anything that you desire. What would you like me to do for you? And famously, Abdul Muttalib simply says, you captured 200 of my camels. I'd like them back. And Abraha is kind of dumbfounded by this. He's like, what? And Abraha says, honestly, I had heard so much about you. And when I saw you, I was so inspired and in awe of you that in my heart, I had immediately thought that if this man asks me not to destroy the Kaaba and leave right now, I'll turn around and leave right away. And Abraha says, but I've lost respect for you. And Abdul Muttalib says, what do you mean you've lost respect for me? And Abraha says, you asked me for your camels. You didn't ask me for the Kaaba. You didn't ask me for Mecca. You didn't ask me for anything. You asked me just for your camels. Abraha was astounded by this because the nobility and the dignity of the honor of the Arab was in their generosity and in their kindness and in their protection and caring for others. For example, the hospitality of the Arab was so famous that even if, for example, a locust came and sat on my tent, I wouldn't allow you to harm the locust because it was on my tent. Because that was the sign of the hospitality and the sign of the care of the Arab. And here Abraha is seeing this Arab sitting in front of him, who should be famous in all of the world and is well known everywhere. Yet this Arab is not asking him for the sanctity or the protection of the Kaaba or the sanctity or the protection of Mecca, but is just asking him for his 200 camels. So Abraha says, how could you be the leader when you don't even care about anything else except your own camels? And the reply of Abdul Muttalib is really famous. And Abdul Muttalib says, that house has an owner, and the owner will take care of his house. I am the owner of 200 camels, so therefore I am asking you for what is my responsibility to take care of. You deal with the one who you're attacking, not with me. This exchange really set Abraha off and really confused him about what was he dealing with here and what was really going on here. And what was the character of Abdul Muttalib that he forgoes? He doesn't even acknowledge the hospitality, the guardianship of the Arab tradition, and only asks about his own property. Abraha is really confused by this, and overcome by this, he turns and he says, okay, fine, take your camels and go. And Abdul Mutalib takes his 200 camels and he heads back. When he goes back to the city of Mecca, the few people that are left there, he says to them, go away, leave. But he himself stays, and a few of the Arab dignitaries stay with him in the city of Mecca. And they ask Abdul Mutalib, what are we going to do? How are we going to handle this? What's going to happen? And Abdul Mutalib says, it's not our problem. When the next morning comes, Abraha again, now he intends to come and attack the Kaaba. So again, he sends his emissaries who come into the city of Mecca and scream and yell at the people and say that, oh, people, run away. Abraha and the army of elephants are coming now. They are on their way now, and this is your last chance to get away. After this, we're not responsible for what happens to you. But Abdul Muttalib doesn't leave. He stays by the Kaaba, and very famously, he makes a dua. And in his dua, he famously makes a statement that, oh Allah, you are the keeper of this house, and no one can attack a house unless if the keeper allows him. And that, oh Allah, you see their animosity that they have towards your house, and therefore you have the responsibility to protect your house. The words of the dua vary, but essentially Abdul Muttalib pleads with Allah and he says, oh Allah, I have no authority except to believe in you. And this is your place. And how can someone cause harm to your place except that you allow them to? And why would you allow them to harm your house? This dua of Abdul Muttalib is very famous, and it's been narrated in different words in different sources through both Sunni and Shia sources. The collective make the agreement that the dua of Abdul Muttalib was to no one other than Allah, and that he believed in Allah only, and when in a state of great difficulty, he didn't rely on the power of anyone except for Allah. And sure enough, as Abdul Muttalib is standing in front of the Kaaba and the army of Abraha is approaching, they see that the attack of Allah comes, and they see a giant cloud in the sky coming towards them. And this was a cloud of small birds that are known as ababil, small little birds. And that every small little bird that was flying in the direction of the Kaaba had a total of 3 stones with it, one in its beak and one in either of its feet. And they all flew in the direction of the Kaaba. And as the elephants had approached and the army had approached to the Kaaba, but had not touched or reached the Kaaba yet, the birds from above began to drop their stones upon the army of Abraha and on the elephants. And they went and they destroyed the entire army by the attack of these little birds with pebbles. That's such an army that the Arab had never seen before, that the Arab had no way of defending against, elephants that they had never seen before. All of these were completely destroyed. What's said is that the only one left was either Abraha himself or one of his emissaries, who returned back to the king of his time. Now, when the army was destroyed, they were all destroyed except for one person. And that one person retreated and left. And he went all the way back to Habash. He went back to Ethiopia. And as he explained to the king what happened to this giant army that had been prepared in the defense of Christianity, in the defense of the church of Sana'a, in the defense of the empire of Ethiopia, and to establish them and firmly plant them as the leaders of the environment, that as this emissary was standing there explaining to the king that we were destroyed. And the king asks, how were you destroyed? He says, we were destroyed by birds throwing stones at us. The king starts to imagine in his mind, these must have been like giant birds. These must have been like huge birds with like giant boulders falling from the sky. That entire army, I mean, think about it, an elephant and the ababil are small birds, and these stones and pebbles are really small. Ababil can't hold very big stones. And he's thinking to himself, how big could this have been? And as the emissary is like, no, they weren't huge birds. They were really small birds. He goes, as a matter of fact, and looks up and he says, King, it was a bird much like that. And just as he says that, one little ababil, one little bird drops a stone and kills the emissary in front of the king. So that the king would believe as well too, as he had just witnessed how this happened. So he needed to see this process, and therefore Allah allowed him to see the authority of Allah and the power of Allah. Now, this entire incident gave us a couple of different points. One, it gave us the significance of the year. This event took place about 50 to 60 days before the birth of our Holy Prophet. And therefore, in the Arab tradition, where things were not named by numbers, they were named by events, this year became known as Amul Fil amongst the Arab, the year of the elephant, because for many, if not all of them, it was the first time in their lives they had seen an elephant. and that the elephants came all the way to this location, and that all of the elephants were destroyed and killed in this fashion when they tried to destroy the Kaaba. Stories were a big part of people knowing what the history of a place was, and therefore mentioning Amul Fil was one of the ways that the Arab would then ask the question, well, what happened in Amul Fil? Why is it called the Year of the Elephant? And then the story would come about that elephants came to the Kaaba to destroy it, and then the elephants were destroyed by these little birds, and that these stones destroyed this entire process, and that nothing had survived this incident. As a matter of fact, we take a look and we see that Allah, when He recounts this as well too, Allah recounts this in Surah Al-Fil, which is the 105th chapter of the Holy Quran. And Allah makes sure that this event remains fresh in the minds of people for the rest of the history of this world, and it's never lost. By Allah mentioning Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi ashabil fil. Did you not see how Allah dealt with the possessors of the elephant, or the people of the elephant, referring to the army of Abraha? Alam yaj'al kaydahum fi tadlil. Did He not cause their entire war to end in confusion? وَأَرْسَلَ عَلَيْهِمْ طَيْرًا أَبَابِيلَ. And He sent upon them birds in flocks, these ababil in flocks, تَرْمِيهِمْ بِحِجَارَةٍ مِّن سِجِّيلٍ. And that they were the ones who were then cast against them stones of baked clay. فَجَعَلَهُمْ كَأَسْفٍ مَعْكُولٍ. And He left these people as if they were chewed up straw, as if nothing was left of them in that incident. This entire narrative, this entire story, Allah wants to make sure stays reflected and attached, showing the authority of Allah and the belief in Allah of the forefathers of our Holy Prophet, that Abdul Mutalib was a muwahid, was a believer in the one true God, and how Allah fulfilled and protected his land, and how the trust of Abdul Muttalib stayed in Allah, and that this is the time when the Prophet came, when such amazing things were happening in the world. In the same way, inshallah, next week we'll recount the actual event of the birth of our Holy Prophet and the amazing events that take place at the birth of our Holy Prophet, and mention briefly about his father Abdullah as well too. Abdullah, the father of the Holy Prophet, was an amazing and imposing personality who became married to Bibi Amina bint Wahab, who was from the nobility of Yathrib at a young age. And it's narrated that either in the months or 2 months leading up to the birth of the Holy Prophet, or the 2 months after the birth of the Holy Prophet, Hazrat Abdullah passes away from a sickness in the city of Yathrib. His grave was actually in Medina for a very long time, and it was kept away from people until eventually the people there in approximately the 1970s actually moved his grave under the excuse and the premise that they were expanding the boundaries of the masjid in Medina, that they moved his grave away from there. Now we don't know exactly where his grave is, according to most, and that it's been lost to us in this time, which is why in Medina we don't have a place to go visit the grave of the father of the Holy Prophet. But inshallah, we'll continue our discussion next week, and we pray to Allah and we take this moment to make dua, that by the sake of Allah, by the sake of this dua, by the sake of the Ahlul Bayt and the Masoomeen, and through the wasila of the Holy Quran that recounts for us the story of Ashab Fil, that, oh Allah, keep us and our families on the upright religion of Islam. Oh Allah, give us tawfiq to learn lessons from the Holy Quran. Oh Allah, give us tawfiq to learn from the example and the seerah of our Holy Prophet and his family, and to implement their lifestyle in our lifestyles. Those amongst our families in our community that are suffering through sickness, may they receive shifa'ah. May all of our hajat be answered, and may the hastening of the reappearance of Sahib al-Zaman take place sooner and sooner. We request that we finish the session with 1 Surah Fatiha, 3 times Surah Ikhlas, لأرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات, with your loudest of salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.